It all started, as most suburban apocalypses do, with an email. An email from Brenda. The subject line, a crimson slash of all caps against the otherwise muted tones of my inbox, read, "Urgent. HOA Bylaw Section 7. Paragraph 3. Subsection B violation." I sighed, a sound that was becoming my personal anthem. "Here we go," I muttered to my lukewarm coffee. This was my life now. A life measured in HOA infractions and passive-aggressive emails from the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, Brenda Millard. The email, a masterpiece of bureaucratic fury, detailed how my lawn gnome, Norman, was precisely 0.75 inches too close to the sidewalk. 0.75 inches. I'd placed Norman there with ironic intent, a little ceramic beacon of whimsy in a sea of beige conformity. Brenda, it seemed, was immune to irony. She was probably out there right now, with a laser level and a grim satisfaction, cataloging Norman's transgression. I should have known when I bought this place. The manicured lawns, the identical mailboxes, the eerie quiet that only comes from everyone judging everyone else's hedge height. It was a siren song for the control freaks, and Brenda was their conductor, orchestrating a symphony of petty tyrannies. Later that morning, I was in the front yard, defiantly not moving Norman, when Brenda materialized. It's a skill she has, appearing from nowhere like a slightly frumpy ninja, armed with a clipboard and a visor that seemed permanently attached to her meticulously permed hair. "David," she said, her voice as tight as her perm, "we need to discuss Norman." "Brenda," I replied, aiming for a casualness I didn't feel. "He's a gnome. He's not trafficking contraband, not to my knowledge anyway." "The bylaws are clear, David." She tapped a finger, a surprisingly aggressive digit on her clipboard. 0.75 inches. It's about maintaining standards. What if everyone put their gnomes 0.75 inches too close? Anarchy, that's what. Anarchy by lawn ornament. "Sounds festive," I offered. My blood pressure was already doing the Macarena. Arguing with Brenda was like trying to explain quantum physics to a particularly stubborn houseplant. A houseplant that issued fines. She actually pulled out a tape measure. The sunlight glinted off it ominously. She knelt, measured with the precision of a brain surgeon, and then shook her head, a slow, sorrowful movement that conveyed the crushing disappointment Norman had brought upon our otherwise orderly street. "This is simply unacceptable." The argument, if you could call it that, escalated. I held my ground. Norman wasn't budging. It was a matter of principle now. My principle, his ceramic inertia. Brenda, her face flushing a rather alarming shade of puce, declared, "Some people have no respect for order. This whole neighborhood is powered by rules, David, rules! And if they aren't respected, I'll have to take this to a higher power." I figured she meant the HOA board. Maybe a strongly worded letter to the Regional Gnome Anti-Defamation League. I was wrong. So very, very wrong. She spun on her heel and marched off. Not towards her house, but down the street. Towards the utility substation access gate at the end of our cul-de-sac. "She's not really going to... is she?" I murmured to Norman. He remained stoically silent. "What's she going to do? Complain to the Transformers?" A tiny, cold worm of dread started to wriggle in my stomach. This felt disproportionate, even for Brenda. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose curtains twitched with the regularity of a metronome, peeked out her window. We exchanged a look, the universal "Brenda's on the warpath, batten down the hatches" look. I watched from my porch as Brenda reached the substation gate. It was supposed to be locked, bristling with warning signs, but Brenda, fueled by bylaw righteousness, seemed to be fiddling with it. And then, she was inside. I fumbled for my phone, my mind racing. Who do you even call for that? The Gnome Gestapo? The homeowner heavyweights? Before I could dial, there was a sound. A deep, resonant clunk that vibrated through the soles of my sneakers. And then silence. A profound, all-encompassing silence. My fridge stopped humming. The rhythmic whir of Mr. Henderson's ancient window AC unit died. The traffic lights at the main road blinked out. She didn't, I whispered, the words swallowed by the sudden, oppressive quiet. It was 95 degrees out, high noon in a Texas July. No power, no AC. And I had a sickeningly clear premonition of who the higher power Brenda had been referring to was. It wasn't the HOA board. It was the actual honest-to-God power grid. The neighborhood woke up slowly. Then, all at once, people emerged from their houses like confused, sweaty meerkats, blinking in the harsh sunlight. Alarms began to shriek. House alarms, car alarms, probably a few medical alerts. Kids started crying. Dogs, sensing the shift in the cosmic balance, began to bark hysterically. My pint of midnight caramel sea salt swirl in the freezer was, I knew with grim certainty, beginning its slow, sweet descent into a dairy puddle. And then I saw her. Brenda, walking back from the substation, calm as you please, a faint smirk playing on her lips. She looked pleased with herself. Mr. Henderson, his face already glistening, bellowed from his porch, "What in the Sam Hill happened to the power?" Brenda, addressing the small crowd that was now coagulating in the middle of the cul-de-sac, placed her hands on her hips. Well, perhaps now people will understand the importance of following the rules. Some of us were creating an unstable environment with unauthorized decorative placements. "Brenda!" I yelled, my voice cracking slightly. "Did you do something at the substation?" "I merely ensured the operational integrity of the community's infrastructure," she announced, which was clearly being compromised by rogue elements. Operational integrity? Rogue elements? She was talking like she'd single-handedly averted a zombie apocalypse, not plunged us into a sweaty, powerless purgatory because of a garden gnome. The woman was a menace, a well-meaning, utterly terrifying menace. The neighbors, their faces a mixture of disbelief and rapidly dawning fury, started to close in. Tiffany from next door, a vision of suburban distress, held up a melting pint of something green and lumpy. "Brenda, my pistachio lavender swirl is now pistachio lavender soup. Because of a gnome?" Brenda, unfazed, adjusted her visor. "Tiffany, if your gnome was correctly positioned according to Appendix C, subsection 4, of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, we wouldn't be having this conversation about your regrettable dairy choices." "Brenda, focus," I interjected, trying to sound authoritative and mostly just sounding desperate. "People are hot. Their food is spoiling. What did you touch at the substation? Boo." She gave a delicate sniff. I simply flipped a very large, clearly labeled switch. It said primary community feed. It seemed important. She flipped the primary community feed switch. Of course she did. Why wouldn't she? It was probably red and shiny, practically begging to be flipped by an overzealous HOA president on a righteous crusade. I needed a drink or a new cul-de-sac, possibly a one-way ticket to a remote, un-HOA'd island. The wail of sirens cut through the simmering rage. 2 police cars, lights flashing, pulled into the cul-de-sac. Officer Miller, a man whose weary expression suggested he'd seen the full spectrum of human folly, and Officer Davies, younger, greener, and visibly struggling to maintain a professional poker face, stepped out. "All right, folks, what's the disturbance here?" Officer Miller's voice was tired. "Got a call about a power outage and some aggressive lawn ornaments?" His gaze found me. I offered a helpless shrug that I hoped conveyed the sheer Lovecraftian absurdity of the situation. Brenda, however, saw her moment. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she chirped, brandishing her clipboard like a holy relic. "I've had to take measures to enforce community standards. This man," she pointed an accusatory finger at me, "and his flagrantly misplaced gnome were destabilizing the neighborhood." Officer Davies muttered something to Miller that sounded suspiciously like, "Destabilizing gnome, Sarge? That a new one on the blotter?" "Officer," I said, my voice strained. "She went into the power substation. She climbed the fence. She flipped a switch. A very, very big switch." Miller's eyes, which had the seen-it-all glaze of a man who'd responded to his fair share of cat-stuck-in-tree calls, flicked to the substation, then back to Brenda. I could almost see the gears grinding in his head as he tried to categorize this particular brand of crazy. This was not your average Tuesday domestic dispute. This was advanced. The interrogation of Brenda, which took place on her meticulously edged driveway, was an exercise in Kafkaesque futility. Miller and Davies, bless their patient souls, attempted to extract a coherent narrative. Brenda, however, was a runaway train of HOA bylaws, Norman's subversive influence, and the general decline of Western civilization. She seemed to genuinely believe she had performed a vital public service, like a suburban superhero whose only power was an encyclopedic knowledge of covenant violations. "Ma'am," Officer Miller said, his voice carefully neutral, "with all due respect, HOA bylaws don't typically grant access to or operational control of electrical substations." Brenda puffed up. "But, officer, the substation powers the community, and as president, I am responsible for the welfare of this community. It's an implicit duty. Section 1, paragraph 1 of the Articles of Incorporation clearly states, and this duty involved shutting everything down?" Officer Davies ventured, his pen hovering uncertainly over his notepad. "It was a reset," Brenda declared triumphantly, "to recalibrate everyone's adherence to the established parameters." "She thinks she's rebooting the neighborhood, man," I whispered to Davies, who looked like he was seriously considering a career change. "Recalibrate." She used the word recalibrate. My brain throbbed in time with the relentless Texas sun. I could hear the distant, mournful groans of dying freezers, a symphony of spoilage conducted by the one and only Brenda. Hours crawled by, each one hotter and more miserable than the last. Finally, a fleet of power company trucks, like a convoy of weary, heat-stroked angels, rumbled into the cul-de-sac. Linemen, looking grim and already sweating through their heavy shirts, spilled out. Hank, the lead, a burly guy with a face like a road map of bad days, surveyed the scene. The lifeless substation, the bewildered cops, Brenda, who was attempting to hand him an HOA pamphlet on approved mailbox colors, and the gaggle of wilted, furious neighbors. He exchanged a few terse words with Officer Miller, his frown deepening with every syllable. "You're telling me a civilian?" "A civilian," he repeated, the word dripping with disbelief. "Walked in there and threw the main breaker? On a substation this size? Does she have any idea what kind of damage she could have caused? What kind of surge?" He shook his head, the gesture encompassing the sheer magnitude of the foobar situation. "We need to inspect the main transformers, check the feeder lines. Some of these are pole-mounted way back in the greenbelt. Access is a nightmare on foot." Officer Miller just sighed. "Tell me about it. She says the gnome was out of line." Hank stared at him. "The gnome?" Okay, now it was serious, real serious. Brenda, for the first time, looked momentarily deflated, then seemed to decide this lineman, like everyone else, was simply overreacting to a perfectly reasonable act of civic responsibility. My Norman, meanwhile, stood his ground, a silent ceramic instigator of chaos. Little dude had no idea the pandemonium he'd indirectly unleashed. Hank was on his radio, his voice growing increasingly agitated. "What do you mean, Barry's got the gout. Of all the days, we need eyes up there now. See if any lines are down before we try to re-energize and blow the whole grid from here to Oklahoma. He slammed the radio down onto the dashboard of his truck with a frustrated thud. And then my mouth, operating on a rogue signal completely independent of my brain, decided to chime in. Mr. Hank, sir? Helicopter, you said? Hank's glare could have melted steel. Yeah, genius. One of them flying machine things. You got one in your pocket? Not exactly, I began, a truly terrible idea blossoming in the barren wasteland of my heat-addled mind. But, I've got some stick time. Quite a bit, actually. Complex systems, vertical takeoff and landing, precision maneuvering, pretty familiar with the dynamics. What in the ever-loving blazes was I saying? Stick time? The only stick time I'd had recently involved a losing battle with a popsicle. I fly a 10-year-old flight simulator, for crying out loud. My crowning achievement in the virtual skies was not crashing a pixelated F-16 into a pixelated mountain more than twice in an evening. Complex systems? The most complex system I'd successfully navigated that day was the self-checkout at the grocery store, and even that had required assistance. This was bad. This was monumentally, catastrophically bad, but Hank looked desperate. His eyes, bloodshot and weary, scanned me up and down. I was wearing a t-shirt with a coffee stain shaped vaguely like Australia and a pair of cargo shorts that had seen better decades. Not exactly the picture of an ace pilot. But the desperation, it was a powerful force. He was probably thinking, what's the absolute worst that could happen? The power's already out. The HOA president is a lunatic. How much worse can this day get? Famous last thoughts, Hank. Stick time, huh? He grunted, rubbing his temples. You military? Private pilot? Something like that, I improvised, digging the hole deeper with a verbal backhoe. More specialized, advanced, simulation operations. My voice cracked on operations. Hank let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of every power outage in history. Look, our chopper's here, but Barry, our pilot, is out. It's a small observation bird, a Hughes 300, nothing fancy. We just need someone to go up with young Jimmy here. He gestured to a terrified-looking apprentice who looked about 12. Spot any obvious damage along the easement before we try to juice this thing back up. You sure you can handle it? It ain't Microsoft Flight Simulator, pal. This was it, the off-ramp. The moment where a sane, responsible adult says, "Actually, Hank, old buddy, old pal, I was just kidding. A little heat stroke-induced humor. Let's all laugh about it later over some non-melted ice cream." I swallowed hard. My palms were slick with sweat. Positive, I heard myself say, my voice sounding like a strangled parrot. Microsoft wishes they had my skills. Piece of cake. Piece of cake? I was a piece of something, all right, but it definitely wasn't cake. Jimmy the apprentice looked like he was about to reenact that famous scene from The Exorcist. I felt like I was about to join him. This is the point of no return, I thought. Or, more accurately, the point of very stupid return. Hank, still skeptical but clearly clinging to the last frayed thread of hope, grunted. All right. You got any way to verify this specialized experience? My mind raced. Gary, my friend Gary. He owed me $50 from a disastrous poker night, and more importantly, he was a congenital liar with a flair for the dramatic. I mumbled something about a secure line and dashed back to my house, the asphalt hot enough to fry an egg on my bare feet if I'd been foolish enough to go shoeless. Gary, code red, I hissed into the phone, cupping my hand around the receiver like a seasoned spy. I need you to be Colonel Stryker, my former CO from the Experimental Flight Simulation Tactical Command. Can you do that? There was a pause. Dave? Are you having a stroke? What in the actual— Okay, fine. Colonel Stryker, got it. What am I verifying, and is this going to involve me having to bail you out of a Mexican jail again? No jail, yet. My unparalleled skills with, advanced rotary wing aerial observation platforms. Another pause, longer this time. You mean your drone? The one you crashed into Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning azaleas last spring? Not the drone, Gary, I whisper-shouted. Helicopter, big boy stuff, real whirly-bird, just make me sound like Chuck Yeager's more talented, slightly younger, and infinitely more handsome brother. And maybe mention my nerves of steel. Dave, your nerves are about as steely as a wet Kleenex. This is gonna cost you more than $50, mate. We're talking steak dinner territory. Done, just sell it. I handed my phone to Hank, trying to look nonchalant. Like this was standard procedure for all highly skilled, albeit unconventionally attired, aviators. Gary, bless his deceitful, steak-loving heart, launched into a performance worthy of a Golden Globe. He wove a tale of my innate feel for the machine, my unflappable calm under extreme pressure, and my legendary performance during the Great Squirrel invasion of 09. A complete fabrication, involving neither squirrels nor heroism on my part, but it sounded vaguely tactical. Hank listened, his expression shifting from outright disbelief to a sort of weary resignation. He handed the phone back. All right, flyboy, let's see what you got. The flyboy was definitely sarcastic. He tossed me a spare flight suit. It was 3 sizes too big and smelled faintly of jet fuel, stale coffee, and existential despair. Jimmy the apprentice, who was now a pale shade of green, handed me a helmet that wobbled precariously on my head, making me look like a bobblehead doll about to embark on a very ill-advised adventure. The safety briefing was a masterclass in brevity. Hank pointed. That's the up-down stick. That's the spinny-roundy pedals. Try not to use them too much at the same time. It gets complicated. And for God's sake, don't touch that red button. He gestured vaguely towards a large, very prominent, very red button on the console. It pulsed, almost beckoningly. Jimmy, bless his terrified little heart, whispered, "Are you sure about this, mister? Barry, our regular pilot, he usually sings bawdy sea shanties when he's nervous before a tricky flight. And you look like you're about to conduct a silent opera of pure, unadulterated terror." "Confidence, Jimmy," I said, my voice a reedy squeak that betrayed the monumental fraud I was perpetrating. "It's all about confidence and, pre-flight checklists, which I have mentally performed extensively. My mental checklist consisted primarily of 1. Don't die. 2. Try not to break anything expensive. 3. Seriously, don't die. I was a charlatan, a complete, utter, sweat-drenched imposter. This helicopter, a Hughes 300 that looked like a mosquito with a thyroid problem, was my chariot to either glory or a very messy, very public insurance claim. I had the sudden, intense urge to confess everything, to throw myself on Hank's mercy and beg for forgiveness and maybe a cold glass of water. But then I saw Brenda. She was approaching, a fresh stack of HOA violation notices in her hand, her eyes glinting. She was probably drafting a new bylaw about unauthorized amateur helicopter piloting within residential zones. Nope, up I go. Anything to escape another lecture on the precise permissible decibel levels of wind chimes. I strapped myself into the pilot's seat. It was cramped. It smelled of old coffee, stale fear, and Jimmy's rapidly evaporating courage. Hank slapped the side of the helicopter, a gesture that was probably meant to be encouraging, but felt more like he was swatting a bothersome fly. "All right, flyboy. Get her in the air, and if you scratch it, it's coming out of your... well, we'll figure that out later." The actual lineman who was supposed to go up as the observer, a grizzled veteran named Sal, was apparently running late, stuck in the traffic snarl caused by our little neighborhood power apocalypse. It was now or never, probably never. I took the controls. They felt surprisingly responsive. Like that really expensive joystick setup I'd always coveted but could never justify buying. I vaguely remembered a YouTube tutorial I'd watched late one night. Something about collective and cyclic, and not making them fight each other. Sounded like marriage counseling for helicopter parts. Tower, this is, Rescue Bird 1. I mumbled into the headset, trying to channel every cool movie pilot I'd ever seen. My voice came out sounding like a pubescent Kermit the Frog. Preparing for, vertical departure, for observation of things. Over there. Jimmy, his eyes the size of dinner plates, hissed, "There is no tower, sir. We're in a cul-de-sac, and my name isn't Roger." Right, cul-de-sac tower then. Roger Jimmy, permission to go up? This was it. The moment where my life choices were about to be reviewed by a committee of horrified angels and possibly the FAA. I pulled gently, so gently, on the collective. The helicopter groaned, a sound of protest from deep within its metallic guts. Then it shuddered, a violent, bone-jarring tremor. And then, miraculously, with the grace of a drunken walrus, it lifted, about 6 inches, then a foot. Oh God, I was actually doing it. I was flying a helicopter. Badly. Very, very badly. The neighbors below were staring, their faces a mixture of awe and abject terror. Brenda was taking notes, probably for a new bylaw about unauthorized amateur helicopter piloting and the mandatory installation of rooftop lightning rods. My flight was less a controlled ascent and more a series of panicked, lurching overcorrections. We swayed. We dipped. We did a little spinny thing that was definitely not in any manual. Jimmy was making noises I didn't think were physiologically possible for a human being to produce. I'm pretty sure I saw Norman give me a tiny ceramic thumbs up from my lawn. Or maybe it was a middle finger. It was hard to tell from this altitude, which was, generously, about 50 feet. The goal, the only goal, was to get high enough for Jimmy to see the main power lines running through the greenbelt behind our houses. He was shouting, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rotors and my own hyperventilating, pointing a shaky finger towards a tangle of trees near the creek. "There, that one! By the big oak! It's down! I see sparks!" "I see it," I yelled back, my voice cracking. The sparky thingy, near the leafy thingy." My technical jargon was, I felt, top-notch. I am not a pilot, I am a leaf on the wind. A very scared, very unqualified leaf in a vibrating, deafening metal death trap. But I saw the line. Mission. Sort of. Accomplished? Now for the hard part. Getting this infernal machine back on solid ground without becoming a permanent, smoldering feature of Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias. Landing, it turns out, is significantly harder than taking off. Especially when your primary flight training involved a plastic joystick and a packet of Cheetos. My approach was, let's call it unconventional. More of a controlled plummet with occasional spastic bursts of upward terror. Hank was on the ground, his arms waving frantically, his face a beautifully rendered portrait of horror and disbelief. I was aiming for the flattest patch of grass I could see next to the substation, a patch that seemed to be shrinking with alarming rapidity. The skids hit the ground with a teeth-jarring, spine-compressing thump. Then silence. A blessed, beautiful silence, broken only by the sound of Jimmy the apprentice fervently kissing the earth. Hank was the first to reach us, his face ashen. "You're alive! The helicopter's mostly alive! What in the blue blazes was that?" I unbuckled my harness, my hands shaking so violently I could barely manage the clasp. "Precision aerial observation, Hank," I managed, my voice raspy. "Just like I said. Lines down by the big oak in the greenbelt. You're welcome." I think I might have saluted, or possibly just twitched. I did not die. This, I felt, was a major win for the day. My heart was attempting to escape through my rib cage. I desperately needed to lie down. For about a week. Sal, the grizzled lineman observer who was supposed to have been my co-pilot, finally arrived, huffing and puffing. He took one look at the slightly askew helicopter, at me, disheveled, reeking of fear sweat, at Jimmy, who was now curled in the fetal position, muttering about the sanctity of solid ground, and just slowly shook his head and walked towards the power trucks without a word. Some heroes don't wear capes. Some just wisely opt out of certain death traps. The power was slowly, painstakingly being restored by the actual professionals. The neighborhood was buzzing. I was, depending on who you asked, either a local hero or a Class A moron who should never be allowed near anything more complex than a spoon. The jury was still very much out, though leaning heavily towards moron. Officer Miller was taking my statement, his expression one of profound existential weariness. Officer Davies was on his phone, presumably trying to explain the situation to an increasingly incredulous FAA agent. "Yes, sir." "A lawn gnome?" "No, he doesn't have a pilot's license, but he did mention extensive simulation experience. Yes, the HOA president." "She what?" "Oh, she's filing a complaint about unauthorized aerial surveillance now?" He sighed and rubbed his eyes. Brenda, surprisingly, was quiet. Maybe even a little impressed, in a deeply disapproving sort of way. Or perhaps she was just busy drafting new bylaws pertaining to the minimum approach altitudes for civilian aircraft over designated gnome sanctuaries. "So, just to be clear for the report, Mr. David," Officer Miller said, his pen poised over his notepad. "You operated an aerial vehicle without a license, based on extensive simulation experience, to assist the power company. After an unauthorized civilian, that would be Brenda Millard, our esteemed HOA president, caused a multi-block power outage over a lawn gnome dispute. Is that about the size of it?" "Pretty much, officer," I admitted, though extensive might be stretching the truth a tad regarding the simulations. Occasional and often ending in a fiery, pixelated crash is probably more accurate. I fully expected to be arrested, or at least fined into the next geological epoch. But mostly, I was just profoundly grateful for the returning hum of air conditioners, a sound sweeter than any symphony. Small mercies. The next morning, the world felt almost normal. Power was on. The faint scent of ozone had dissipated. I was on my porch, sipping coffee, Norman back in his rightful, slightly too close to the sidewalk spot. I had survived. I had faced down HOA tyranny and accidental aviation, and lived to tell the tale. Then I saw it. Tucked neatly under Norman's little ceramic fishing rod, an official, crisp, cream-colored envelope from the Homeowners Association. My blood ran cold. I picked it up. My name was typed, perfectly centered. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "Dear Resident," I read aloud, my voice flat. HOA Bylaw Section 12, Paragraph 7, Subsection D, Unauthorized Landing of Rotary Aircraft. Please be advised that the operation and landing of personal or commercial helicopters within community common areas or private property is strictly prohibited without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee and a minimum of 750 verified signatures from affected residents. A fine of $500 per unauthorized landing axle has been assessed. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in further action. I paused, then continued to the postscript. P.S. Norman is still 0.75 inches in violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3, Subsection B. This is your final warning. Brenda. Of course. Some forces of nature are immutable. I looked at Norman. He stared back. That same serene, enigmatic, ceramic smile plastered on his face. I swear he winked. Or maybe I was just sleep-deprived, mildly traumatized, and still vibrating slightly from the helicopter ride. Either way, one thing was certain. Life in this cul-de-sac was never, ever going to be boring. And you know what? I might actually look into those helicopter lessons. For real this time. Just in case Brenda decides the squirrels are plotting something next.